All right, this week on Ask Alicia, we're going to talk about Appraisals 101. Not so much that's going to make you go, ugh, because that's how I feel when I get too much data. But you need to know some of the basics. Appraisals are mandatory if you're getting a loan. I don't care if you're waiving it and you're saying you don't care, you're paying the difference if the house doesn't appraise. What they mean by an appraisal, it's not just the comps or the competitive analysis that the agent's pulling up. However, that is very important to see that so you can kind of see what's going on in the market. An appraisal is done by a licensed appraiser. They are just as licensed just as we are as agents or anybody else that are licensed. Their license is part of the DPOR. Some of them have access to lockboxes and some of them don't. They're typically managed by big depots, like big brokerages. And what happens is the lender of the buyer, so you might be on the listing side, you might be on the seller side, but it's the buyer side that procures the appraisal, and it's paid for by the buyer actually. So the buyer actually has to give their lender some money. Around $500 typically is what an appraisal costs, sometimes more, sometimes less. Then the bank on the buyer side actually submits the request. It goes in blindly and we don't even know who it's gonna be. We say a prayer every time that it's a good appraiser because they're not all equal, right? Sometimes they come from further away or they're just not experts in the business locally and hyper-locally, and we all know there are certain neighborhoods that hold more value than other neighborhoods. You kind of have to be a local person to know, right? So that's why as agents, we really love our local lenders specifically because they tend to pull local appraisers and not just some random person that's picking up the appraisal that could be living potentially an hour or 2 hours away maybe and not really know the market, or maybe kind of retiring and not know what's going on. So we as agents sometimes push for a local lender for this number one reason. That's a really key for appraisals. Now appraisals are done, they actually have to go back, they can go back up to 6 months. And what they look for is a comp meaning the closest relatable home and the closest distance. They don't usually go more than a mile out of the radius. That's why we like to pull in the neighborhoods or the elementary school district, but they will not go further than that unless there's no house to compare it to. Then they go further out, which they call that an arm's reach. But they're not going to compare a ranch one-level home to a 3-story home. They try to look for the most similar homes. But sometimes when the inventory is low like it is now in 2021, you kind of like, what are we going to do? You don't have a comp, so you kind of have to do an additional comp, meaning additional added value to certain homes. Like if a house has 3-car garage and the selling home only has a 2-car garage, you would subtract value for that the extra third garage. So there's a whole formula that appraisers use to come up to the value. But we as agents try to make sure that we pull comps similar so we know we're in that range to make the house appraised. And with the market moving as fast as it is, some of the appraisers are actually doing some price adjustments based on the valuation. Because I think this past summer, it was crazy. There were some huge jumps, so they needed to make adjustments to that. The worst thing that can happen is the house doesn't appraise and then the seller has to lower the price or the buyer has to pay the difference. So that's why it's really important to make sure when you're offering for the home not to go crazy unless you have the money to make the difference out or the seller's willing to drop the price. Because ultimately, you're borrowing money from the bank and they're not going to loan you money unless there's an appraisal that meets the value. Number 2 thing to think about is what type of loan you're getting. If you're getting an FHA loan, which is backed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which is a government-backed loan, just as a veteran's loan is, those appraisals stick with the house. I repeat that, they stick with the house. So sometimes people tend to lean more towards a conventional loan or cash. Of course, cash still is great. Cash is always great because you don't even need an appraisal with cash. They can waive that completely. So this is kind of the biggest things to think about, and that's why as agents, it's so important to have an agent navigating this process for you. It's actually more complicated than it seems. It seems so easy on HGTV and these shows that make it look so easy that you can just sell your house, walk away with the money and no problems. But I always say everything is good until it's not. And we always have this appraisal conversation with all of our sellers and buyers before we go under contract and list, because it's so important to understand where these numbers are coming from and what the potential of appraisal can be. So ask those questions when you're listing your house or buying a house, but don't be afraid either, because the market is continuing to grow. And if you have to pay the difference, if you love the house, the value is really what you're willing to pay for it. And if there's 10 other people willing to pay for it, don't you think the value is there? Just because an appraiser, one person says it's not, doesn't always mean it's law. So that's my 101. Ask Alicia.